introduction. Wow, I was getting a little emotional. But it is a true pleasure to be here. Folks, you want to come in? Yeah, come on in. Yeah, come on in. There's some places here.
We could sit on the
Yeah.
floor, I was told.
Yeah, floor is awesome. Sit up here if you all want. There's a chair right here. If folks wanna, yeah, like on the side, please. I am so blown away by this turnout. This is amazing. Thank you, Chris, for the introduction. Special thanks for all the staff and faculty that made this visit possible. Special thanks to JP and Chris for inviting me. And this has been in the works for a few months now, and I'm just this is a true honor to be here, to get to share my work. So for folks, this is my email and this is my Twitter handle. So for folks that want to give me feedback or have more thoughts or want book lists or whatever, want to get in touch, please do. Feel free to reach out. Folks that would want to live tweet this talk, please do. I see all of my talks as public goods, so feel free to do your thing, tweet away. So today I'm going to talk sex work, media networks, and Transpacific histories of affect. And like what Chris said, it comes out of my first book, Transpacific Attachments, Sex Work, Media Networks, and Affective Histories of Chineseness, in which I think through issues of social formation, cultural identity, sexual citizenship, specifically by focusing on the figure of the so-called Chinese sex worker in Transpacific literature and media. And so by Transpacific, the book specifically looks at this particular circuit. One is cultural production that circulates between the US, China, and so-called Sinophone regions. And what I mean by Sinophone are regions that are on the margins of China and Chineseness. So for instance, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, Tibet, Xinjiang, right? So these regions that are kind of seen as marginal or marginalized by ideas of Chineseness or China proper. So I'm looking at this particular Transpacific circulation here. And so I wanted to dwell a little bit about what the Transpacific as a methodology does for me, right? So the Transpacific allows me to create critical pathways across more established frameworks of analysis like the nation, right, ethnicity, or language itself. So it kind of cuts across multiple disciplines: area studies, ethnic studies, critical race studies, comparative race studies, migration studies, diaspora studies, right? So it creates this critical pathway across these frameworks of analysis that oftentimes don't house folks that fall through the cracks nicely. I'm thinking about folks like refugees, migrant workers, right? Domestic workers, undocumented folks, or sex workers, right? And so this is why the Transpacific scope to me was very important, because it stresses the linkages and movements produced when, say, national, ethnic, and linguistic particulars are put into contact. This is kind of another way of thinking through more bottom-up forms of connection that fall through the cracks of the ways in which we analyze folks in motion, right? And so, for instance, the book reads the recoding of Chineseness in particular as a very kind of sticky, the word that Chris just used, contact zone, right? It's a contact zone that has a very long shelf life in Transpacific ideological networks. Wars are fought over this. Folks are displaced over this concept, right? And folks in Hong Kong are fighting right now with the sticky relationship with this concept itself, right? So I look at this idea of Chineseness as this contact zone. And with a Transpacific framework, then our attention then moves away from the authenticity of national or cultural origins of this idea of Chineseness, since currents are actually produced collectively and through the process of contact. So what I'm really doing by kind of rethinking this concept of Chineseness through the Transpacific frame is to emphasize relationality, right? And to emphasize the uneven power relations between these contexts that get drawn when we expand our scope a little bit. And so the book studies not necessarily the truth value of Chineseness originating in any particular location, the US, China, or Sinophone regions, but rather the affective impact or the cross currents, right? Created when these intersecting conceptions of Chinese character is in play. So focusing specifically on the so-called Chinese sex worker as a focal point. So I want to pause a little bit and ask you all some questions. Y'all ready? Okay, so perhaps the first most obvious question. So if the book is kind of focused on this question about Transpacific social formation, why focus on the Chinese sex worker figure in particular? What kind of work does that do? Any guesses? Be brave. I got you. Just throw things out here.
Why?
I can ask the question again. So if the book is about tracing this history of Transpacific social formation, right? Why focus on the Chinese sex worker figure? It seems awfully specific. Yes, go.
Maybe because the sex worker's body in many different contexts is like actually like a very sticky body.
Yeah.
A lot of discourses can be placed onto her body.
Yes.
Especially when she's a racialized figure.
That's right. I love that. Right. So it becomes a very kind of it's a body that is oftentimes represented for and not by. Right. So they're oftentimes used as discourses internationally, nationally. Right. To kind of talk about issues of the boundaries of sexual citizenship, right? What is the boundaries of normativity, of decency, right? Of body politics, right? These are figures that, depending on how they flow from nation to nation or across nations or not within nations itself, oftentimes being kind of utilized and evoked for very sticky forms of ideology. I love that. Anyone else want to come in here? Yes, JP.
It puts sex in its messiness
Yes.
front and center in
That's
analysis
right.
of mobilities, migrations, border control.
I love it, right? That sex itself is not clean, is not compartmentable, right? It is a question about sex, and it's questions about sex and labor as both messy processes, right? That depending on the ways in which these concepts or these ideologies transmutate on bodies or gets coded on bodies in the movement through national or transnational circuits, that it gets then coded or recoded or decoded very differently, right? For very different purposes, oftentimes for purposes of power. So we'll get into that a little bit more. Anyone else want to come in here? Yes?
This is the combination of eroticism and exoticism.
Oh, I love it. Yes, especially on, let's say, the Asian sex worker body, right? The combination of eroticism and exoticism, right? So I don't know if you all kind of saw the recent article came out about the Stanford case, the Emily Doe case, right? That we can't understand the Emily Doe case without understanding the long history of eroticism and exoticism between Asia and the Americas, but also the question about militarism, right? And so absolutely, there's a very long history here that we're talking about. Yes?
Also, I feel like sex workers are their bodies that can enter spaces while still remaining invisible somehow.
Yeah, exactly, right. So these are oftentimes bodies that have mobility, but don't have oftentimes the kind of public infrastructure, right, in order to be housed comfortably in that mobility itself. I love that. And so kind of tying in all of these answers, really brilliant answers, we could see the Chinese sex worker in particular as having a very long history of operating as a Transpacific trope, a sticky character itself that has very much, at least since the turn of the 20th century, signified both Asian American sexuality and Asian modernity. And so this, in a way, then the figure constitutes then a pivotal reflection on the link between not only sexual, cultural, and class marginality, but also between Asia and the Americas. And I'll make this point with the example that Chris actually brought up in the introduction, right? The Paige Act of 1875. How many folks know about this Paige Act 1875 in the United States at all? All right, not many, that's all right. I got you. So in the United States, the management of Chinese human trafficking through laws like the Paige Act actually read Chinese working class women, female immigrants as all sex workers unless proven otherwise. And then because of that kind of assumption, right, then legitimizing the banning of Chinese working class female immigration into the US under the name of anti-trafficking for 7 decades, right? So whenever I teach this to my students in the US, they're like, this is ridiculous, right? How would we even ever contemplate a bill that imagines that all female working class folks are one profession, and that one profession is sex work? It seems very ridiculous, but I think to kind of flip this question around, what does that do, right? It's a very powerful bill, right? And like what Chris said, it was the first immigration bill that targeted specific race-based exclusion, and also very hypergendered at this point. Any guesses? What does this do? What does this seemingly very ridiculous assumption do? Why did it take hold for decades?
Racism?
Racism, right? Well, there you go. So there, of course, yeah, the racism legitimized this, all right, and so it didn't seem like a big deal, right? Okay, so the Orientalist imagination of Asian bodies, or specifically Asian females, is hyper-eroticized and exoticized, allows for this to not be that much of a stretch, right? Anything else? I mean, what does it do to the body politic of the U.S. then? Like, why go through all this trouble in addition to racism? Yes.
Helps to legitimize anti-miscegenation ideology.
Yeah, so it helps to legitimize anti-miscegenation ideology. Remember this time, a lot of the kind of rhetoric around why we need to ban Asian females, specifically Chinese women, because they could taint the white body politic, right? That they could allure the white men. So there's a certain kind of biopolitical reasoning to this too. Anything else? JP, I saw your hand up. Very good. What happens to the Chinese men that get to come in to work on the railroads and do the hard labor work? And anyone? Yes.
It
Go.
always calls them as sexless.
Yes, absolutely. So they get to be coded as sexless or effeminate, right? It takes away that masculinity. And so to kind of put all these things together, also it bans, especially in a time when only heterosexual marriage was legalized and only intraracial marriage was seen as a thing that was legal. We're basically making a bachelor society for 70 years. Right? And so by making a bachelor society for 70 years, we're making sure that we have transient labor, right? Folks that cannot settle here, right? Couple this with the Cable Act, couple this with the Alien Land Law. These folks will never be able to own land, will never be able to pass down the next generation legitimately. That means that they won't have kids that have voting rights, because in the US we have birthright citizenship, right? So we're talking about basically banning birthright citizenship of specifically Asian working class folks. And this is something I do want to kind of emphasize. Folks in the upper echelons, right? Folks in the elites, they can come in and out. The Chinese elites can come in and out. They could bring their families, they could have families. Working class. It's the working class that were targeted, that were not allowed to reproduce the next generation for voting rights and not allowed to settle, right? So this is talking about producing transient labor force for 70 years, right? So it rationalizes the barring of generations of Chinese female immigration, which created a gender imbalance, and by extension prevented the settling down of Chinese working class nuclear families in the US for over 7 decades. In such a legal framework, what this is interesting is that prostitution was then positioned as a uniquely Chinese problem that was tied to age-old feudalism and Confucian patriarchy. And so the legalized policing of Chinese female bodies worked to justify 2 things, right? Both anti-Chinese exclusion laws, yellow peril discourse domestically, but also outwardly the civilization rescue narratives of imperial expansion at the turn of the 20th century. So it does double work, both internally but also externally too here. So you could see why the figure of the sex worker, specifically Chinese sex work, was so pivotal in allowing for both the the double work of domestic race-based exclusion, but also external imperial expansion at this pivotal time. So this is a good example of this. This is drawn from a political cartoon from a San Francisco chronicle in the early 1900s. Here we see the supersized Uncle Sam rescuing a Chinese woman from the Chinese male coolie, who seems to be trafficking her into the US through the San Francisco Bay. So the caption reads here, with his Oriental experience so extensive, Uncle Sam should have no problem to handle the local slavery problem. So such representations of Chinese female immigrants as helpless, unfree sex slaves that need to be saved by more democratic or benevolent force, in this case Uncle Sam, works to resolve the paradoxical tension between US domestic Chinese exclusion, which A, frames the Chinese coolie figure as immoral, feudal, and oppressive to their own women, right? And B, then uses this Orientalist racialization to justify the US empire's civilizational expansion into Asia during this time. So make note, this is a time in which the US is going into Japan, the Philippines, China, and so this kind of justified then that kind of movement as a civilizing kind of maneuver, right? A benevolent form of expansion. Of course, then this led its way to larger exclusionary measures, such as the Chinese Exclusion Acts in the 1880s. And all these exclusionary measures didn't get lifted until 1943, in a moment in which the US needed China as an ally to fight World War II. Right? So we're talking about a good extensive amount of time. So now, even with the repeal of the Chinese exclusion laws during the mid-20th century, the figure of the Chinese sex worker didn't really go away. Alongside the rise of second and third world feminisms, global interest in Chinese sex work reemerged during the Cold War as attention was turned towards women of color and third world feminism, as evident in the now canonical work of kind of Gail Hirschadter and Sue Groenworth, which is becoming kind of these pivotal texts about Chinese sex work. Now, contingent to academic interests in Chinese sex work is the way discourses on sex work rights in post-colonial regions such as South Korea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan have been central to mobilizing social movements that probe issues of contemporary citizenship, human rights, and globalization. And so full disclosure, and Chris kind of mentioned this already in the introduction, why I got into this project to begin with was because my parents were academics but also labor rights advocates who organized alongside a sex work rights organization, an activist group called CAUSEWAS, or Zhizhitren, which you can see here, who were one of the most kind of pivotal figures in the labor rights movement in Taiwan in the 1990s. So a lot of the work that I tried to start with and extend in the book was basically an extension of the labor rights work that I saw growing up and really admired. Work that is so pivotal and necessary, like Folks in Swan, that is here, local organization that's doing this here in Vancouver. So to not take away from the importance of the work on the ground, but to extend it into a larger kind of cultural historical conversation about the discursive work and the symbolic work, and that discursive and symbolic work has itself a long history. That long history has text that circulates internationally, right? So this is why I look at a Transpacific scope here. So, as the figure of the Chinese sex worker has itself a history of mobilizing analysis of Asian and Asian American and American modernity, labor, and state governance, I read the figure as a certain affective laborer of history. So again, I want to pause here a little bit. Just to briefly explain what I mean by affect. Anyone want to give a guess? What do you think I mean by affective labor? Seems like fancy words.
No, thank you for asking that question.
Yeah.
I never understand what affect is.
Yeah, let's unpack that. Yeah, let's do it. Anyone want to give a guess?
Isn't it emotional?
Well, yeah, so it's definitely tied to emotional work, right? So, which we're going to get into. There's a long debate between, affect scholars about if it's emotion, is it, we'll get into that. So yeah, so it has some kind of contingent relationality with labor that manages emotion, right, or desire. Anyone else want to come in here? Any guesses? All right, I got you, don't worry. So I want to make, I'll break down what I mean by affect then, right? So to be clear, I approach affect as a politics of emotional mobilization. So exactly to your point, right? So it is something that's contingently tied to this question about emotions, care work, desire, right? Desire work, intimacy work, right? A lot of kind of the long genealogy of feminist thought uses a different name, reproductive labor, right? Life work. So it has a very long genealogy in different disciplines with different names. But so affect scholars have had this long debate again, right? What is affect? What is emotions? Are they the same? Are they different? Does one have more political potential than the other? Oftentimes what folks say between, the kind of common distinction being that affect is kind of dynamism created between bodies, right? And mobilized outside of social structure. So a good example would be like feeling the room, sensing the room. Like I don't have really a language to pin that down, right? But it's like, oh yeah, there's a lot of dynamism in this room because folks are here, they're packed, they're on the ground, right? Like, you know, like there's a lot of energy here, right? So this kind of visceral dynamism between bodies is affect, something that you can't pin down through socially learned language, like happiness or excitement even, right? And so that would be kind of in contrast what a lot of folks call emotion by affect theorists as being things that are actually socially learned, right? I've learned what happiness is through kind of social context, and so I could pinpoint down certain emotions like angriness, sadness, happiness, right? I could talk more about this in the Q&A if folks are interested. I go against this line of thought. Natural rebel. And this rebellion against this kind of distinction, I am actually building off of a very long genealogy of post-colonial women of color kind of scholarship that does not see this emotions and affect as distinctive, as separate, but actually intricately tied processes, right, that are not outside of social constructions of, say, race, sex, or gender formation, right, but in fact mobilizes in relationship to it, right? The reason why I'm feeling the room the way that I am is because I am coded the way I am, right, in this historical moment as an Asian female body, right? So these are things that are tied. It's not something that just kind of mobilizes universally. It's something that's tied to the ways in which our social codings and the ways we socially learn things mobilize what I feel like sitting next to you, or what I feel like standing in front of y'all. You all with me so far? And so the way in which I read affect, I read it alongside emotions, right, as not just private expressions, but as public practices that has the potential to reorder our individual relationships to the social. Right? The ways in which I feel, or the ways in which I galvanize, or the ways in which you can mobilize tension in this room has the potential to reorder our understandings of this room altogether. You all with me so far? So instead of thinking about, my work doesn't look at specifically what affect and emotions are, I look at what they do, right? The sociality of affect and emotion. How are emotions mobilized? How do they affect? How do they affect this space and this time? What do we create in this 1 hour together, right? I don't see affect or emotions as private psychological universal states. I see them as historically specific social cultural practices that have material consequences and have their historical conditions, material conditions. They're not this wish. Happiness is not coded the same thing 5 years ago as it is right here. Happiness is not coded the same thing in academia or on the streets, right? Happiness is not coded the same thing in Vancouver and in DC. So there are material conditions tied to the ways in which we understand and decode these kind of intimate relationships themselves, right? And here I'm not reinventing the wheel. I'm kind of building off of really important work by like Sarah Ahmed, Lily Xie, Haiyan Li, Claire Hemmings, just to name a few. So there's some really amazing work that's being done on affect and affective labor that kind of pushes against, the distinctions that want to then universalize this theory, especially since now affect theory has become really sexy and snazzy. To not forget our feminist roots, right? To not forget our anti-colonial roots when we think about affect as labor itself. I think that's the most important thing. And so the ways in which I use this is to think about Chinese sex work as an affective labor of history, going back to my point, right? That I approach the figure as a cultural medium that has historically allowed for various collective feelings to not only take shape but also constantly reshape. So for me, it was important to return then the affective work or affective labor of these figures within historical context, right? To show how then historically it has mobilized, not only locally but also internationally, through a very long stretch of time. So for me, and this was a very risky kind of decision to make, right? Because I'm already tracing something so abstract, I'm also tracing something so long in terms of historical stretch. But for me, it was very important, or else we can't see how things are shaped and reshaped, right? And so the book then looks at 3 particular moments. And what I see as these three, why these 3 particular moments are important is that I see those 3 particular moments as moments in which we are massively rethinking the ways in which the worlds are being divided. Massively rethinking global division. So for instance, I start with the turn of the 20th century, this kind of 2-world system, imperialism, anti-imperialism split, and then the 3-world system during the Cold War, and then the so-called 1-world system in which we're assumingly collapsing into one in a free market economy in a neoliberal present. So I'm looking at these kind of 3 particular moments and tracing how then the figure does different work when we see it transgressing not only through space but also through time. So for today, I'm going to kind of pick a little piece from the book as an example. I'm going to look at chapter 4 of the book, which I look at specifically a novel by Taiwanese writer Wang Zhenhe in 1983, Rose Rose I Love You, published during the Vietnam War. And so Rose Rose I Love You is one of the first Taiwanese novels translated into English. It has an international currency here, and remains one of the most widely read pieces of Taiwanese literature in English today. Much of Cold War era Taiwanese literature, again, to give you a little bit more of historical context, uses the metaphor of Taiwan as prostitute to depict the island's complicated colonial history and its exploited relationships with Japanese colonialism from the past, a rising Chinese empire, and a larger U.S. imperial pressures, especially during the Vietnam War onwards. In Rose Rose I Love You, the author Wong also alludes to the trope of Taiwan as prostitute, but alters its affective connotations. While his predecessors commonly depict the sex worker as the embodiment of loss and subjugation, and this rallying point to articulate nationalistic sentiments, right? Wong's sex workers actually ridicule discourses of national sovereignty altogether, which I'll make an example in just a bit. In the novel, the sex workers are the ones who actually talk back to governing officials with the use of a broad range of unauthorized languages, such as unofficial dialects, curse words, inscrutable grunts, which I'll have examples of that in just a bit. Expressing an affective structure that rejects clear analogies of both a reproductive Chinese motherland and or an independent nativist Taiwanese state. So there's something in between here that the figure is allowing to articulate. That does not allow for the extraction either for national sovereignty or anti-Japanese sentiments either, or even extraction back into the US empire during the Vietnam War. So there's something in between that I see the sex worker articulating by utilizing the currency of that figure in the literary moment at that time. Y'all with me so far? And so I argue that the sex worker under Wong's pen moves, actually, both spatially and affectually. In other words, in analyzing Wong's novel, I shift from previous scholarship, which has focused more on place-bound theorizations, which imply frameworks of territory, locality, and nationality, to an affective analysis, which emphasizes what is seen as emergent, relational, and networked. So I want to be clear here. I'm not advocating for us to move away from geopolitical analysis, right? Place-based analysis is very important, especially when we see the risk of kind of extraction into larger empire narratives, right? So this work is very important. I'm just saying, let's hold on to this work, put it into motion, right? Put these things in contact, right? Put these things in contact and see what we can create. What if these things are unfixed, right? What if these analyses can be broadened or shift? Let's kind of trace that transmutation here. Y'all with me so far? So I'll have an example. Anyone read Roses, I Love You in this room? Chris has. It's all right. I got you. I got you. Don't worry. Hold on tight. So Rose, I Love You is a satirical novel. So whenever I teach this, my students are so confused. Like, we're supposed to be very mad about U.S. imperialism. We're supposed to be very mad about the exploitation of sex work. But this is a satirical novel, so it makes things very complicated, which I'll explain in a few kind of close readings that we're going to do. Set during the Vietnam War, it details only one day in the life of Taiwanese coastal city Hualien, as its residents receive word that 300 American GIs might soon arrive for a weekend of rest and recreation. In response, the town's English teacher, Dong Su-wen, quickly organizes local politicians, intellectuals, and brothel owners to set up a bar complete with local sex workers trained to entertain the dollar-laden U.S. troops. While the whole novel seems to be about the English teacher's preparations for what he calls bar girl diplomacy, the sex worker's apathetic and at times even defiant reactions to his arrangements call into question the value of the novel's very gist. In fact, there really is no plot line. It's at the very end of the novel, we don't even know if the American GIs even come. So it really is, there is no plot. It really is just about the preparations and the ways in which these sex workers are refusing to be prepped in a way. And so it would seem that instead of the plot development, what is emphasized is rather the translational politics involved in Wong's very use of language itself. This can be seen when the English teacher gives the sex workers English names and tries to teach them how to pronounce it. Now, repeat after me. My name is Patricia. Nothing? Speak! As her face crimsoned, student Lee seemed to be calling for her mother in Mandarin before her voice gave out. Ma, name. Here, student Lee struggles to articulate the very first word of the English self-introduction, reflects then within the narrative's depiction of affect, actually, in red, being peppered with silent nothings, ellipses, and fragmented dashes. Now, this goes on for 9 full pages. It's a lot of stuttering, a lot of crying, a lot of like, why are you doing this to me, for 9 pages. Now, finally, after pages of stutter and silence, snot and tears, the sex worker, student Lee, eventually pieces together a string of words. Here we go. She forces herself to raise her tear-streaked face. Her lips quivered until she finally managed to do what she was told. Mani yishiba. She chewed on her lip and whimpered for a moment. It sounded to everyone as if she had said barikishia. Mani yishishi barikishia. She's done it! She said the whole thing! Suwon was beside himself with joy. So in this scene, very complicated scene, we hear actually the coexistence of separate yet intersecting narratives. We detect, for instance, marked in black, narratives which celebrate the English teacher's successful instruction of bar girl English. She said, my name is Patricia, in his years, right? But also marked in blue. We also hear competing sentiments or the affective elements, right? Announced through depictions of student Lee's tears of embarrassment and fear. And finally, marked in red, we hear sounds of disobedience through the student Lee's so-called English rendition of the name Patricia, which retains the sound of her cursing, I'll give you hell and beat you to death, if heard in a combination of Mandarin Chinese and Taiwanese dialects, right? And so this becomes a question about whether or not the reader can train their ear, right? That she is already defiant, but it's not necessarily just about whether or not the subaltern could speak. It's whether or not we could hear the subaltern speak, right? Becomes then the flip of the question. These narratives are allowed to coexist, mediate, and at moments remain incommensurable to each other in terms of meaning and untranslatable in terms of sound. For as the narrator recollects a cacophony of discourses, dominant and minor, ideological and affective, he creates a bastardized fable of Taiwan nation building, which deconstructs power relations between languages and the articulation of Taiwanese national identity in the face of US involvement. All right. The story closes with the popular song Rose, Rose, I Love You, which is what the novel is named after. While the sex workers were taking a lesson about the popular venereal disease, Saigon Rose, the English teacher had a stroke of genius. He thought they should sing the song Rose, Rose, I Love You to welcome the American GIs. 玫瑰有玫瑰嘴角美，玫瑰有玫瑰最艳丽，长夏开在枝头上，玫瑰有玫瑰我爱你。As a tune that has already both English and Mandarin versions, it was, in the English teacher's mind, the perfect song to sing to welcome the American GIs. And in fact, the song's lyrics arguably echo the novel's satirical gist. The sweet and charming roses here allude to both the sex workers that are to sing about them, and this has a very long tradition in terms of Sinophone and Chinese literature in which roses are symbols of sex work or courtesanship. And arguably this sexual love that they are to market as they allure their clients to wound their tender stems in precious blood. So to push this reading further into the realm of the oral, we can see that the Mandarin pronunciation for rose, 玫瑰, sounds eerily similar to that of America or US, 美国, especially if sung out loud. 玫瑰有玫瑰，美国美国。 Moreover, the translation of Saigon, as in Saigon Rose, the venereal disease they were learning about, Qigong, in Mandarin looks and sounds identical to the Mandarin term Western tribute, Qigong. This adds on a layer of satirical meaning to the tale. For as Josh Kuhn argues, music is never completely detached from politics or the history of it. I go on to stress that what amplifies the politics attached to both the history and the study of musical circulation is the way it moves, with attention to both the spatial and affective dimensions of the term. And so in the final stretch of this talk, I'll focus on tracing the Transpacific genealogy of this song, Rose, Rose, I Love You, and its movements, to kind of close things out. So the song emerged into popularity when performed by Shanghai actress Zhou Xun in 1941. Sung by the noted sing-song girl and further popularized through China's mainstream commercial cinema, as opposed to the left-wing revolutionary cinema of the time, Rose, Rose, I Love You was one of the many tunes dismissed as so-called yellow music or decadent sound. As Andrew Jones explained, so-called yellow music was regarded by both the nationalist government and left-wing intellectuals as decadent sound, 靡靡之音. To them, it promoted political passivity and seduced citizens away from unified sentiments of nation-building and anti-imperial resistance. Indeed, after the communist takeover in 1949, so-called yellow music like Rose, Rose, I Love You was banned from mainland China, only to reemerge in different forms across geopolitical borders. For instance, Rose, Rose, I Love You's English version was released by Columbia Records in the US in 1951, written by British radio presenter Wilfred Thomas and sung by American singer Frankie Lane. The English version of the same tune told a very different story. 玫瑰有玫瑰 for my eastern rose, men crowd in dozens everywhere she goes, in her rickshaw on the street or in a cabaret. Please make way for Rose, you can hear them say, all my life I shall remember Oriental music and you in my arms. Perfume flowers in your tresses, lotus-scented breezes and swaying palms. Rose, Rosalie, do my ship is in the bay. Kiss me farewell now, there's nothing to say. East is east and west is west, our worlds are far apart. I must leave you now, but I leave my heart. Circulated shortly after World War II came to an end, the song transforms into a swan song sung by a Western soldier as he bids his Eastern rose farewell. Through the song's translations, or rather transmutations, one can detect what Andrew Jones calls a curious doubleness of yellow music, in which yellow signifies both pornography and racial identity, eroticism, and Chineseness. What it is excessively emphasized is essentialized culturally marked difference, the Oriental in front of the music, the Eastern in front of the rose, emphases which was absent in the tune's Mandarin antecedent. From this post-World War English rendition of the song, we can hear tones of Asia's colonial history from which Orientalist imaginations of the East spurred. We can also detect an intimate account of Western military involvement in Asia through the two world wars. In the context of Wong's novel, the song's narrative of an ill-fated East-West encounter works as an analogy not only of the Vietnam War at large, but also Taiwan's expulsion from the UN in 1972 and its broken affair with the US in 1978, during which Wong's novel was actually set. However, many have argued that the most immediate source of Wong's inspiration for using the song in his novel is the Hong Kong filmic remakes of the Shanghai oldie in the films Red Rose and Calendar Girls. As Taiwanese musicologist He Donghong argues, Mandarin Chinese music was, during the Cold War, what the Taiwanese Nationalist Party promoted in order to carry out a de-Japanization through Mandarin-speaking movements. So Mandarin oldies like Rose, Rose, I Love You were then redeemed from its dirty and yellow past to now be recoded as a clean and healthy medium to articulate what He Donghong calls a nationalist structure of feeling. Or in other words, a state-regulated Taiwanese feeling of unified yet entertaining anti-Japanese and anti-communist sentiments. Here, the Cold War circulation of Rose, Rose, I Love You is attached to a nationalist project of Taiwan nation building. Its Mandarin version was propagated to fuel anti-Japanese and pro-Mandarin sentiments. Its English version was, as depicted in Wong's novel, performed to solicit lucrative intimate relations with the US. So to conclude, Rose, Rose, I Love You's translingual mutations and transpacific travels complicate then the supposed univocal call for genetic or political authenticity. I stress that it is precisely through these movements that the tune is able to create spaces in which discourses of national and cultural nativity in Wong's tale gets contested. Released in 1983, Wong's novel comes out at a historical juncture at which Cold War divisions were on the verge of collapse and neoliberal renditions of global connectivity was on the rise. Seen in this context, I argue that Wong's Rose, Rose, I Love You, both novel and song, heralds a so-called minor transnational notes, which offend unifying choruses of global connectivity while not invoking dominant rhetorics of cultural and national authenticity. This overlapping focus of the transpacific and affective then offers the language of movement, desire, and becoming that allows us to think more broadly across national, cultural, and linguistic frameworks. It shifts questions of cultural identity away from centralizing notions of authenticity and homeland discourse, often evoked through place-bound analysis of territory, locality, and nationality, and repositions it as an emergent and constantly transforming theoretical question, tracing an affective analysis of the emergent, relational, and networked. This minor transnational focus on the transpacific affect is what leads me into my second book, tentatively titled Liaisons and Alliances, Transpacific Crossings, a Neoliberal Order, in which I'm trying to trace the minor to minor forms of labor and collaboration in the neoliberal contemporary, in which we kind of privileged and individuated consumption and kind of hyper-extraction into a marketplace, right? Some good examples of this, one that we're going to be workshopping in the afternoon workshop is a chapter that I wrote about Karente Yamashita's really brilliant novel, I Hotel, which recounts kind of the 60s and 70s movement politics in San Francisco, organized around this particular hotel called International Hotel, and that really evoked the Asian American movement. But also how then her reimagining of that moment connects actually to kind of more anti-colonial movements in the 60s and 70s in China, and Chinese revolutionary movements at the time. So thinking through that minor connection, how that then, going to the past and reimagining the past, opens openings for the future. Another chapter that I'm working on right now is actually on some African American poets that work in and write about China currently, and focusing specifically on Kyle Dargan's recent anthology, poetry anthology, Anagnosis, which actually was just shortlisted for a Pulitzer. And how kind of their ruminations about possible Afro-Asian linkages can help us think through then collaborative efforts and possibilities in this moment of neoliberal containment, or what Jody Millimet calls multicultural neoliberalism. And so these are just examples of kind of how this work is kind of ongoing. And so while my first book focuses on representations of sex workers in relation to transpacific creations of cultural identity, I hope the work opens up further inquiries about the temporary worlds or collective attachments that we are all in the process of co-creating. Thank you very much.
We have about 10 minutes for questions.
Please. Oh, yes, please. Go for it.
About the book,
Yes.
what the motivation of the writer and the reader writing such a book in 1903? When they started?
It's very interesting in terms of like thinking through then readership. So the author is actually really well known in terms of writing against the grain of state censorships. So he's really well known as kind of a nativist writer in the sense that at a time where a lot of kind of writers that were making it in Taiwan were folks that were from the Chinese diaspora. He was kind of a local kind of Taiwanese person that focused on actually indigenous folks and focused on kind of longer traditions of kind of native folks on the land, which Rose Rose I Love You was actually banned for a very long time by the kind of cultural administrator of Taiwan for being too dirty and for not giving a kind of clean and healthy national image, right? So actually readers weren't actually, there was like a very brief moment, a few months, where the book came out that was actually circulated, was banned, and then because it got so much international kind of pickup, that it got kind of recirculated back as this kind of popular text again. So the book itself has its own very interesting kind of transnational travel itself in terms of accumulating different cultural currency, but it was seen as kind of a dirty text, right? And that dirtiness itself created then kind of possibilities for kind of different conversations. So even though it was banned, it was actually known. So does that answer your question? So it's just the readership shifts in terms of what decade, by whom, at what time. What was his motivation? I can't speak for the writer, but I could speak for the, like I said, the kind of long genealogy of works that he's put in. He was kind of writing against a lot of the work that was popular at the time, which talked a lot about kind of Chinese diaspora and their nostalgia for the so-called mainland nostalgia. For him, he's like, folks have been here for centuries, right? And folks not only had to endure Japanese colonialism, we have to endure Chinese settler colonialism, and we have to endure US imperial pressures at the same time. So his work was very well known to kind of push back against all of these imperial forces at the same time, not willing to be in service of the Taiwanese state at the moment. Yeah.
And you mentioned two other books before.
Yes, yes.
When were they published?
So this was, Rose Rose I Love You was his last book. He actually died of cancer shortly after this. And so a lot of his books before, and I'm happy after the talk I kind of give you a list, but he's well known for a lot of short stories.
My question is about the two books you mentioned.
Yeah.
Different dangerous pleasures. And
Oh,
other books. So
yeah, those-
Where do they come from?
Those are history books. So those are historians that actually picked up the issue of Chinese sex work and decided to write a cultural history of that. So they have now been kind of canonical in any study of Chinese sex work, especially in North American academia. Again, I would be happy to talk to you more about that after the Q&A, and I'd be happy to give you a book list if you're interested.
We have a couple open seats.
Yeah, if folks want to kind of sit in. Other questions? Yes, go for it.
Earlier when you showed the lyrics of the song in
Yes.
Chinese,
Yes.
was that screenshot or excerpt from the novel?
No, it was not excerpt from the novel. It was assumed that folks knew the song because it was so popular.
Yeah.
But the afterword by the translator actually had more kind of conversations about the song afterwards, assuming that the English reader would not know the song by heart. But when the writer was writing at that time, the assumption would be that this was so popular that folks already knew the song.
Yeah. Oh, I asked because like the photo that you had of it
Yeah.
had is it the rhythm?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it was interesting because just right before that you talked about the line, the hyphen, the ellipses,
That's
as a type of
right.
affective punctuation.
That's
So
right,
when I saw the song, I was like, and as you were singing it,
Yeah,
so
that would have been so brilliant, right, if that script was on there. But no, I mean, I love your point about kind of the connection between the song and affect. So oftentimes when I teach affect to students, I always say that singing or music is one of the most easiest ways to understand it, because if you think about sound needs to be created through the bouncing between bodies. You can't see it, right? But it's created through the vitality and dynamism created through bodies, right? And so it also creates intimacy. It shrinks the space, right? So that's why whenever I talk about this chapter, I like to sing it, because that's my attempt of like kind of enacting affect in a way of kind of shrinking the space with you all instead of kind of showing maybe a recording of it. That is the affective work, right? That affect can be created even if it's invisible, but bounce between bodies to shrink its space, right? To create intimacy. And so that's an excellent point. Yeah.
Thanks so much for this. I'm struck that the texts seem to exist so distinctly from the actual bodies and lives of sex workers themselves, and I'm wondering if you have more to say about the networks or relationships or affective spaces kind of between the text and sex workers themselves.
Yeah, no, so the whole book actually varies from the cultural productions and actual sex work figures. So the introduction, I start actually with the sex work, the coalition called Kazwas that my parents were a part of. They were a part of it in the 90s, but when I started writing was when a lot of these kind of leading figures were about to die. So there were like series of memorial services for these kind of activist sex workers, which was really amazing in terms of thinking about they were also using symbolic work even at the very end of their lives. So for instance, I talk about their protest song that they actually wrote with the labor advocacy band together. And at these kind of memorial events, they would kind of sing together, going to your point about affect and song, right? So at these rallies and these kind of protest venues, it would be kind of this massive concert in a way. And so I do a kind of analysis of the cultural work, but also the symbolic cultural work, but also the kind of on the ground embodied work that's happening simultaneously at the time, including while folks were memorializing the kind of passing of the leading figures. When the co-chair of the whole coalition called Li Jing, she had, in the last few days of her life, she decided to occupy the space of the brothel that they used to work in, which became then actually the organizing hub of the whole coalition as a way to fend off kind of gentrification pressures by these kind of corporations that were coming in and trying to buy out this historical land. And so even at the very end, like her embodiment and the folks surrounding her, using the cultural symbolisms and that they've accumulated for decades, basically, kind of creating that space altogether. And so the book tries to kind of think about tries to not conflate the work of real-life sex workers and the symbolic work, but also sees them as intangent, right? That to think about then the work in the actual figures and then the work of those that try to advocate or the work of those that represent as in this kind of uneven power relation, but still strung together in terms of this circuitry of affective network, right? To then how then in that circuitry we figure out not how to speak for, right? But also how to hear and advocate, but also in terms of tying that into larger systems of cultural history in which, going to your point in the very beginning, how these figures to begin with become such symbolic figures. Why are they so sticky, right? Figuring out those larger questions too. So they're kind of collaborative historical linkages, but be very careful not to conflate the two at the same time. Yeah. Saw hands.
There's just 1 minute left, but
Yeah.
I just wanted to sort of like, if you have a minute to talk about it,
Yeah.
just thinking about the fact that the book was banned.
Yeah.
I'm really curious about that, especially because it sounds like that was an affective response. To
Yes.
that made that happen.
That's right, absolutely. I love that. No, absolutely. So this is what I mean by affect having material conditions and material consequences, right? And the ways in which it was justified for banning was that it was offense to the year, that it was dirty, right? So that it's an insult into our visceral body. And because of that kind of affective, that is definitely an affective response, right? Using that as what legitimized, right, the banning of this work. Even if you go to actually the official documents of the Paige Act, right, or the official legitimization of these kind of anti-Chinese exclusion laws at the time, a lot of it was affective language about yellow threat, right, about threatening and invasive, the words that talk about the invasion into the body politic, right? A lot of that is kind of affectively motivated. So this is why, to me, the tracing of even the official the kind of privilege and official language that utilizes the affective labor is important to figure out the material consequences and the pressures put on these folks' bodies and how they're constantly being used and unhoused. And to kind of trace that history, we need to see then to deal with these openings seriously, to deal with the symbolic work seriously in order to understand what is the material violence that is tied to both the symbolic and the discursive and the ideological, but also the embodied at the same time.
I think we should end it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.